It was a bright, sunny morning in the city of Lagos when little Ivy's life changed forever. She was only 6 years old, a cheerful, playful girl who loved to sing and dance around the small garden of her mother's house. Her mother, whom she adored deeply, had been everything to her, her protector, her comforter, and her guide. But one cold afternoon, her mother fell seriously ill. Ivy didn't know how to help. She was too young to understand the weight of what was happening. After a few days of battling her illness, Ivy's mother passed away, leaving her little girl all alone in the world. Ivy's mother had made arrangements before her passing. In her will, she named Ivy's uncle, her younger brother, as the guardian. She left behind a large fortune for Ivy, but there was a condition. Ivy could only claim it when she turned 16 years old. Until then, she would live with her uncle, who had a family of his own. His wife, Patricia, and their daughter, Martha. For a brief moment it seemed like things would be fine. Patricia and Martha were kind to Ivy at first. They welcomed her into their home, and even though they were not as affectionate as her mother had been, they showed her some warmth. Ivy, still too young to fully understand the loss of her mother, tried to adapt to her new life with them. She felt safe for the time being. But soon after Ivy's mother was buried, tragedy struck again. Ivy's uncle, the only person who could have stood up for her, collapsed from a heart attack immediately after his sister was buried. He died shortly after, leaving Ivy in the care of her aunt Patricia, who was now her legal guardian. With no one to turn to, Ivy found herself alone and vulnerable. At first, Patricia seemed like she was going to honor her late husband's wishes. But everything changed the moment Patricia moved into Ivy's mother's house. The house was much bigger and more luxurious than Patricia's old home, and it was filled with beautiful things: fine furniture, expensive clothing, and valuable jewelry. Patricia's eyes gleamed with greed as she surveyed the new house that would be hers, at least for the next 10 years, until Ivy turned 16. Once Patricia felt settled into her new surroundings, her true nature began to show. She became cold, distant, and cruel to Ivy. The very first sign of her wickedness was when she decided to burn all of Ivy's clothes. One morning, Ivy woke up to the smell of smoke. She hurried downstairs and found Patricia in the backyard with a large fire pit. All of Ivy's favorite dresses, shoes, and toys were being thrown into the flames by Martha, who laughed as they burned. Ivy cried and begged them to stop, but Patricia grabbed her by the arm and sneered. "You don't need these clothes anymore. You'll get new ones when we can afford them." The truth was, Ivy's mother had left more than enough money for her, but Patricia wanted to pretend they were poor. Patricia had a plan. She wanted to keep Ivy in the dark about her inheritance, and she had already started plotting to use the money for herself and Martha. She claimed that Ivy's mother hadn't left much behind, and that they could only afford to send Martha to a good school. Ivy would have to be sent to a lesser, cheaper school, Patricia declared. When Ivy heard this, she felt a deep sense of sadness. She loved her school and her friends, and the thought of leaving broke her heart. But when Patricia tried to transfer her, she was met with a surprise. The school's principal informed her that Ivy's mother had already paid for Ivy's entire education up until the end of secondary school. Patricia's face turned red with anger. This wasn't part of her plan. She had wanted to save the money for her own daughter Martha, so she could send her to the most expensive school in the city. Furious, Patricia returned home and unleashed her rage on Ivy. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because your mother left you some money. Well, let me tell you something, little girl. That money is mine to control until you're older. So don't get too comfortable." From that moment on, Patricia's attitude toward Ivy grew more vicious by the day. Martha, who had always been a little spoiled, quickly took after her mother's cruel ways. She began to see Ivy as a burden, someone to pick on whenever she was bored. At first, it was small things, hiding Ivy's toys, making fun of her clothes. But as the days went by, Martha's torment became unbearable. She would report on Ivy for the smallest things, and Patricia, always eager for an excuse to punish Ivy, would beat her for anything. One evening, Ivy accidentally spilled a glass of water at dinner. Before she could clean it up, Martha ran to tell Patricia, who stormed into the room, belt in hand. Without a word, she dragged Ivy outside and whipped her harshly, leaving deep red marks across her skin. Ivy cried, but Patricia showed no mercy. "You'll learn to be more careful," she spat before leaving Ivy alone in the cold. Ivy's heart ached with loneliness. She missed her mother terribly, and she often wished that her uncle hadn't died. With him gone, there was no one to protect her from the cruelty of Patricia and Martha. The once warm house had become a prison, and Ivy, who was only 6, began to realize that her life had taken a dark turn. But in her quiet moments, Ivy remembered something her mother used to tell her. "You are stronger than you think, my sweet girl. No matter what happens, you will overcome it." These words stayed with Ivy, even in the worst moments. Little did Patricia and Martha know that Ivy, despite her age, had a strength they could not see. It was the kind of strength that would one day change everything. And so, Ivy endured, waiting for the day when her true destiny would be revealed. As time passed, Ivy's life under Patricia and Martha's care only grew worse. The kindness they had once shown her disappeared entirely, replaced by cruelty that Ivy could never have imagined. Patricia had grown more comfortable in the house, treating it as if it were hers. Ivy, now just a shadow of the joyful girl she once was, spent most of her days doing chores while Martha enjoyed all the privileges Ivy should have had. Patricia's wickedness knew no bounds. She made sure that Ivy had the worst of everything. While Martha wore new dresses and fancy shoes, Ivy wore tattered hand-me-downs. The food Patricia gave her was often leftovers, cold, stale, or even barely enough to keep her full. Ivy wasn't allowed to eat at the dining table anymore. Instead, she ate on the floor, far from everyone else. Martha, who had once been friendly, now joined her mother in tormenting Ivy. As if things couldn't get worse, Patricia soon brought someone new into Ivy's life, a boyfriend named Fred. Fred was a rough, careless man who drank and smoked all the time. He wasn't like Ivy's uncle, who had been gentle and caring. No, Fred was the complete opposite, loud, mean, and rude. And just like Patricia and Martha, Fred had no sympathy for Ivy. Whenever Fred came over to the house, Ivy was sent to the market or the dangerous roadside to buy him beer and cigarettes. It didn't matter whether it was day or night, or how scared Ivy was of the dark streets. Patricia didn't care. "Go and don't come back until you've bought what Fred wants," she would snap. Ivy, too afraid to disobey, would rush out, running as fast as she could, praying that nothing bad would happen to her. But one evening something terrible did happen. Fred had sent Ivy out late at night to buy more cigarettes. The streets were dark, and the market was almost empty. Ivy hurried as quickly as her small legs could carry her, clutching the little money Patricia had given her. But as she made her way back, she felt a hand grab her from behind. Ivy screamed, but there was no one around to hear her. The men who grabbed her were kidnappers. They threw her into the back of a van and drove off, leaving Ivy terrified and helpless. All she could think about was how her mother used to warn her to be careful. But now no one was there to protect her. She was alone, and she had no idea what would happen to her. Back at the house, Patricia and Fred didn't even notice Ivy was missing. They were too busy laughing and drinking to care. Days went by, and still Ivy didn't return. But it wasn't until Ivy's school noticed her absence that anyone began to worry. Her teachers, who knew Ivy as a quiet but bright student, were concerned when she didn't show up for several days. They called Patricia, but she made up excuses, saying that Ivy was sick and couldn't come to school. The school principal, however, wasn't convinced. After a week of not seeing Ivy, he decided to involve the authorities. Soon, a lawyer who had been left in charge of Ivy's inheritance was contacted, and the police were informed of her disappearance. When the lawyer spoke to Patricia, she pretended to be worried. "Oh yes, Ivy has gone missing. I've been searching for her everywhere. I don't know what happened. She must have been kidnapped while playing outside," Patricia lied, pretending to wipe away fake tears. The lawyer wasn't entirely convinced, but he couldn't prove anything yet. The police launched a search for Ivy, and after a few days they found her. She had been dumped on the side of the road by the kidnappers, battered, bruised, and terrified. She had been through a nightmare, and her small body was covered in bruises. When the police rushed her to the hospital, she was barely conscious. Patricia didn't even come to see Ivy at the hospital until 3 days later. By then, Ivy was weak but still alive. When Patricia finally showed up, she acted as though she cared, but Ivy knew better. She saw the coldness in Patricia's eyes and knew that this woman didn't care about her at all. It was just an act for the authorities. Ivy's time in the hospital gave her a chance to recover, but it also gave her time to think. She realized that no one was going to save her from Patricia and Martha. No one was going to stand up for her. She had to survive on her own. Even though she was just a little girl, Ivy knew she had to find her inner strength, the strength her mother always believed she had. After spending several weeks in the hospital, Ivy was released. But things didn't get better for her. In fact, they got worse. Ivy had to use a wheelchair for some time because of the injuries she sustained from the kidnapping. When she returned home, Patricia and Martha didn't help her at all. They left her to struggle on her own. Ivy had to drag herself around the house, using her small arm